Nicolas Cage, an Oscar-winning icon, has existed for more than 4 decades between glory and chaos. A man who has redefined what it means to be an unpredictable actor in Hollywood, from the raw despair of leaving Las Vegas to the cold madness in Face Off. He has walked the brightest stages on the planet, not with perfection, but with raw emotion, instinct, and a will that would never be controlled. Millions see him as a symbol of boldness, of freedom, of an artist who dares to go all the way. But those same millions have also laughed at him, because behind it all, behind the explosive roles and the blinding lights, is a story that is not glamorous at all, but full of cracks. A childhood spent growing up in emotional instability, with a mother who suffered from mental illness and a family where closeness never truly existed. A couple a name that he was forced to abandon, not because he wasn't proud enough, but because he could not live in its shadow. The early years were not about hunger, but about confusion about himself, about who he really was in a world that had already defined the path for him. Then, when he reached the peak, when all of Hollywood had to recognize him as an undeniable talent, that was exactly when everything began to slip out of control. Money poured in like a flood, then disappeared faster than the applause. Impulsive decisions, broken marriages, assets sold off one by one as if his life was being dismantled. And then, the most painful thing was not losing the money, but losing respect. When the internet turned him into a joke, when expressions that were once praised became memes spreading across the world. When a man who once stood at the peak of art was seen as something weird that needed to be mocked. And now at the age of 62, when the pace of life begins to slow down, when the roles no longer come as frequently as before, when the laughter and the criticisms have all settled into a long silence, one question begins to emerge more clearly than ever. What is really happening with Nicolas Cage in the shadow of fame? Among the memories that never stop echoing, and a life that he may have never truly controlled. If this story makes you see Nicolas Cage in a different way, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next parts that are even more painful and honest. Nicolas Cage was born on January 7, 1964 in Long Beach, California, into a family where art was not a choice but almost a destiny. His father, August Coppola, was a literature professor, an intellectual, quiet man who lived in the world of books and ideas. His mother, Joy Vogelsang, was a dancer, but behind that fragile beauty was an unstable soul, a silent battle with psychological disorders that no child was old enough to understand, yet small enough to endure. On the outside, the Coppola family was a respected name in the film industry, a symbol of creativity and fame. But inside that house, Nicolas grew up amid long silences, erratic emotions, and a feeling he could not name when he was too young, that everything around him could break apart at any moment. There were no warm evenings like in the movies. There were no hugs long enough to make a child feel safe, only days passing with uncertainty, where voices could turn into silence and the presence of a loved one could suddenly become distant. When his parents separated, it did not come as a big explosion, but as a silent crack that spread gradually day by day until everything could no longer be mended. And in that silence, Nicolas did not learn to ask why, he learned to endure. But there are pains that do not disappear. They only change shape. At school, he was not the most outstanding child, nor was he completely abandoned. He existed in a middle ground where people saw him, but did not really understand him. And in a world where the Coppola name carried so many expectations, Nicolas soon realized that he not only had to become someone, but had to become a version different enough not to be swallowed by his own family. He began to turn to art as an escape. Piano, acting, screenwriting, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because it was the only place where he could control his emotions. There, he could cry without being asked why. He could scream without being seen as strange. He could become anyone except himself. But even in those moments, the pressure never left him. As the nephew of a great director like Francis Ford Coppola, Nicholas had no right to be ordinary. Every step he took was compared, measured, placed in a framework he had never chosen himself. And the more he tried to break free, the more he felt trapped deeper. Loneliness was no longer just a feeling, it became part of his personality, an inner silence that always existed, even when he smiled, even when he spoke. And it was from that emptiness that those strong emotional expressions began to emerge, not because he wanted attention, but because he had no other way to release it. The outbursts, the intense reactions, the strange choices, all stemmed from one very simple thing. He had never truly felt seen as his real self, and perhaps, right from those early years, something had quietly formed. Nicolas Cage did not grow up to become an ordinary actor. He grew up to become a man who always had to fight with himself, and learn to turn that fight into art. Nicolas Cage's young years did not begin under stage lights, but with slow, lost steps in a world he still did not know how to belong to. When he joined UCLA to pursue art, he did not step in with the confidence of someone carrying the Coppola name, but with the obsession of having to prove he deserved to be there. Acting classes, stage rehearsals, script readings, all became inner battlefields where he learned to express emotions while trying to control emotions he himself did not fully understand. But Hollywood did not care about the inner wars of a person. Hollywood only looked at results. And in those first years, Nicolas Cage was not the result they were looking for. He took small roles, supporting parts whose name the audience did not even remember. Projects canceled at the last minute, auditions ending with the familiar phrase, "We will get back to you." And then no call ever came. There were days he left the casting room with a forced smile, only to realize a few hours later that he did not even have enough money for a decent meal. Tuition still had to be paid, life still went on, and the dream, although not dead yet, began to feel heavier every day. To survive, Nicholas did any job he could find: waiting tables, cleaning, assisting teaching, writing scripts that no one asked for just to keep himself from forgetting why he started. His hands no longer only touched scripts, but also carried the smell of grease, the smell of dust from temporary jobs. But there was one thing: he never gave up: emotion. While many young actors tried to learn how to become standard, Nicolas Cage followed a different path. He did not try to become like anyone. He did not learn to act the way Hollywood expected. Instead, he dug deeper into his own instability, the unnamed pains from childhood, the emotional voids that had never been filled. The outbursts he once tried to suppress all began to find an outlet through acting. His style became different, even difficult to understand for many people. Sometimes too big, too intense, too unlike anyone. But that was not a strategic choice. It was the only way he knew to survive in art. And that very difference became a double-edged sword. Some people began to notice, but many others shook their heads. Too much, out of control, not suitable. Those comments were not only aimed at his acting, but gradually touched the person himself. And somewhere between the failed auditions and the shifts that stretched to exhaustion, Nicholas began to face a question he could not avoid. Was passion enough to feed a person? There were nights he sat alone, looking at unfinished script pages, and wondered if he was pursuing art or running away from himself. Money was not enough. Opportunities were not certain, and the road ahead had no guarantees. But then, the next morning, he still woke up, still continued. Not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he did not know who he was if he no longer had art. And it was in that almost desperate persistence that something began to form. Nicolas Cage was not only learning to become an actor, he was learning to endure. Learning to continue when there was no guarantee. Learning to walk in a world not made for him, until it was forced to see him. And then, after years of almost exhausting persistence, The first doors of cinema began to open, not with glamour, but with small opportunities so tiny they could easily be forgotten. Nicolas Cage appeared in The Cotton Club, a film marked by Francis Ford Coppola himself, the famous uncle whose shadow he had always tried to escape. It was not a big role, not a destined moment, but only a light touch into the world he had pursued through all those lonely years. But for Cage, every second on screen meant survival. He did not step onto the film set as an heir to fame, but as someone trying to prove he deserved to exist there. The first working days were not easy. The pressure did not come from the director or colleagues, but from the very name he carried, a name that, even though he had tried to abandon it, still followed him like a reminder that every mistake of his would be seen more clearly, judged more harshly. Working with directors like John Waters, Cage began to understand that cinema was not only technique, but courage to be different, to accept being misunderstood, to go further than what was considered safe. But that path was not smooth. Roles being rejected continued to appear. Contracts that seemed certain fell apart at the last minute. There were days he received praise in the audition room, only to realize a few days later that the role had gone to someone else. There were times he wondered if he was on the wrong path, if trying to be different was really an advantage, or just a way to isolate himself from the rest of Hollywood. And in that struggle, Nicolas Cage made a choice that not everyone dared. He did not change to fit in. He pushed his difference even further. Roles began to carry his own mark, unlike any mold. When others chose restraint, he chose explosion. When others sought balance, he sought extremes. The characters he portrayed were not just they were lived, pulled from the deepest parts of himself. Sometimes that made him seen as too much. But it was exactly that which made him irreplaceable. Gradually, in an industry that loved repetition, Nicolas Cage became something Hollywood both needed and did not know what to do with. He was not the typical star, not the predictable one, but every time he appeared, he forced the audience to pay attention. From quirky, eccentric roles, intense action characters, to psychological roles heavy with instability, Cage began to build something few could name: a personal brand that could not be defined, not because he was perfect, but because he did not try to become anyone else. And while many still doubted, still stood outside to observe and judge, something had quietly happened. Nicolas Cage was no longer just an actor looking for a place. He had become a phenomenon, a man whose every step, right or wrong, carried an indelible mark. But behind that prominence, behind the increasingly noticed roles, another pressure began to form. No longer the question, can he succeed or not, but a much heavier question. Can he continue to prove he deserves everything that is coming, or will everything collapse before he can hold on to it? And then, when the doubts gradually settled down, when the name Nicolas Cage was no longer placed next to a question mark, but began to be mentioned as a separate entity, the 1990s opened up like a door, leading him straight to the peak quickly, blindingly, and almost without giving him time to understand what was really happening. From leaving Las Vegas, where he transformed into a man destroying himself with every sip of alcohol, every lost look, to Face Slash Off, where he stepped into a mad world, turning himself into a distorted version of his own self, Nicolas Cage did not just act. He seemed to be pouring out everything that had never been released in his life onto the screen. And then, the moment he stood on stage holding the golden Oscar statue in his hand, everything seemed confirmed. No longer the outsider, no longer the shadow of Coppola. He had been seen, he had been recognized, he had won. But there was one truth that no one said out loud in that moment, that sometimes achieving everything you ever wanted does not bring the feeling you thought it would bring. Because when the lights went out, when the audience left the hall, when the applause remained only as memory, Nicolas Cage still had to return to himself. And right there, the loneliness began to become clearer than ever. Fame came fast, money came in large amounts, But peace did not. He began to live in a world where everything could be bought: houses, cars, strange iconic items, things that others called luxury, but for him seemed only temporary ways to fill a nameless void. Financial decisions were no longer based on reason, but on emotions that had never truly been stable. And gradually, what had once been the reward of success began to become a burden. Personal relationships did not escape that whirlpool either. Love came fast and intense, but also broke apart at the same speed. Marriages did not last. Connections were not deep enough to hold him. Conflicts that no one truly understood the full cause of. There were moments he stood in a room full of people, in parties where everyone wanted to get close but felt like the strangest person there. Because fame has a dark side, it makes people see you, but not necessarily the real you. And with Nicolas Cage, that became even clearer. Hollywood began to look at him with two extremes. One side was admiration, a daring actor, willing to take risks, willing to be different. The other side was doubt whether he could control himself, or was just drifting with unstable emotions. Audiences were the same. Some loved him for his boldness. Others did not understand him and began to turn away. And amid all those gazes, the pressure began to build. No longer the pressure to succeed, but the pressure to maintain, to not fall, to not be forgotten, to not become a name that was only mentioned in the past. But what made everything heavier was not what happened on the outside. It was what he felt on the inside. Because even at the peak, Nicolas Cage still carried the cracks from the past, voids that had never been filled, questions that had never been answered, and when there was nothing left to chase ahead, those things began to come back. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a lingering feeling that he had gone so far, but was not sure he had reached where he truly belonged. And perhaps, right in those years called the peak, a quiet truth began to form. Nicolas Cage was not only living in success, he was living in another war, a war no one saw, between the person the world expected him to be and the person he was really trying to understand. And then, when the peak years gradually shifted, when the lights no longer only shone on glory but began to illuminate the voids inside, Nicolas Cage's life entered a phase where success was no longer the answer but became the cause of the biggest upheavals. Money came to him quickly, abundantly, almost without limit. But along with it came something else that grew larger with each year: an urge to possess, to hold on, to fill a void he had never truly understood. He bought houses not just to live in, but to feel he existed in a space large enough to contain everything he could not name. Castles in Europe, villas spread across America, pieces of land where he could stand in the middle and temporarily forget the chaos in his head. He collected items that others called strange dinosaur skulls, ancient statues, objects that symbolized the past, as if he was trying to hold on to something beyond time. Luxury cars, extravagant items, all gradually became part of a life that on the surface looked perfect, but was actually built on an unstable foundation. And then, like everything uncontrolled, it began to collapse. Investments no longer yielded returns. Huge taxes he had not realized had accumulated into a burden. Assets that were once symbols of success now had to be sold to survive. Auctions took place not because he wanted them, but because he had no choice. The houses left his hands one by one. The cars that were once displayed as pride now became numbers on paper. And each time, it was not just material loss, but a part of his life being torn away, quietly, without sound. The impact did not stop at finances. It seeped into his spirit. The days when Nicolas Cage used to step onto the film set with confidence now began to carry a different feeling: anxiety, pressure, a silent fear that everything could continue to slip away. There were times he had to face himself in silence, wondering how everything had come to this point. It was not a sudden collapse, but a prolonged process, where each small decision gradually accumulated into a result he could not reverse. And in that situation, he did the only thing he knew. He continued to work. Not because of passion, not because of art, but because he needed to survive. Roles came continuously, not always perfect, not always worthy of his name. There were projects that in the past he might have refused. Now he accepted, not because he had changed his standards, but because circumstances had changed him. Each film was not just a role, but a small step in giving back what he had lost. And while the outside world began to question, began to doubt, began to look at him as an actor sliding downhill, inside, Nicolas Cage was still fighting, not to regain fame, but to hold on to the remaining stability in his life. There was one thing few realized in this period, that his persistence did not come from confidence, but from something much deeper, not allowing himself to stop, because stopping, for him, meant fully facing what had been lost, and he was not ready for that. But right in those hardest days, a new awareness began to form, that money, no matter how much, could not bring stability, if inside there was still chaos. That fame, no matter how great, could not protect a person from his own decisions, and that there were things once lost that could not be bought back, not because their value was too high, but because they had never belonged to the material world. Nicolas Cage did not talk much about this period. There were no long explanations, no excuses, only silence, a heavy silence, but very real. And in that silence, one thing gradually became clearer than ever. He was no longer the man standing at the peak, but he was also not the one who had collapsed. He was in another place, a place with no more glamour, no more certainty, only a man learning to exist, day by day, with everything he had lost and everything he still held on to. And when the financial upheavals gradually eroded everything that had once been built by fame and ambition, another side of Nicolas Cage's life also began to appear more clearly, a side that was not on the screen, not hidden by characters or scripts, but raw, fragile, and full of contradictions. Love and family. He had gone through many marriages, many relationships, each time beginning with an intense belief that this time would be different, that this time he would find a place to stop, a place where he did not need to perform, did not need to prove anything, just needed to be himself. But then, just like many other things in his life, those relationships did not last long. 5 marriages, each one leaving marks, not just divorce papers, but voids that were hard to fill. There were loves that came fast, burned bright, but also faded quickly, leaving behind a long silence where no one knew how to start again. There were moments when Nicolas Cage was next to the person he called his wife, but still felt an invisible distance, as if between two people there was always a clear glass layer, visible but untouchable. And that did not only happen in marriage. Even in friendships, with colleagues, even with family, he often stood on the edge of connection. He could smile, he could talk, he could appear in a group of people, but inside, there was still a quiet separation that not everyone noticed. Perhaps because Nicolas Cage had never truly learned how to be close to others without carrying the chaotic parts of himself. Or perhaps he had become too used to living in his inner world that sharing became foreign. But if there was one place where he could not escape himself, it was in the role of a father. His children did not look at him as a star, did not care about the roles or the awards. For them, he was simply a father, a person who needed to be present, needed to be stable, needed to be a support. And right there, Nicolas Cage faced another challenge. Not how to be recognized, but how not to repeat what he had gone through. He loved his children in the only way he knew, intensely, sincerely, but sometimes also full of contradictions. There were times he wanted to be close, but did not know where to begin. There were times he tried to be a good father, but was pulled back by pressures from life, from work, from issues he had not yet resolved within himself. And then, when looking at his children, he did not only see the present, he saw his own past. Saw a child who once needed to be understood, needed to be held, but did not get that. The joy of fatherhood came in small moments of conversation, a quiet evening, a look without words. But the sadness also came in the same way, quietly, without noise, but enough to stay for a long time. Because for Nicolas Cage, family was not just a place to return to, but the clearest mirror of who he was. And not every time was that easy to face. Love, in his life, had never been a simple thing. It was a source of strength, a place where he found hope when everything else collapsed. But at the same time, it was also the most fragile place, where the weakest parts of him were exposed with nothing to shield them. Perhaps that was why he had never truly stopped in love, not because he did not want stability, but because he was always searching for something he could not define. A feeling of belonging, an uninterrupted connection, a place where he did not need to try to become someone else. But up to a certain point in his life, Nicolas Cage began to realize that some things could not be found outside, that no matter how many relationships, how many chances to start over, if inside there were still unhealed voids, everything would still repeat in different ways. And it was in that awareness that a very small but very real change began to happen. He no longer searched for perfection in love. He no longer tried to turn family into something he thought it should be. Instead, he began to accept that love could also be imperfect, that family could also be full of contradictions, and that sometimes staying even without fully understanding each other was still a form of connection. But even when he had reached that awareness, the feeling of being lost had not completely disappeared. It was still there, like a familiar part of his life, like something he had learned to live with instead of trying to remove. And perhaps that was exactly what made Nicolas Cage's story different. He was not the person who had found all the answers. He was the person who was still searching, even after going through almost the entire journey. And in that journey, love and family were not the ending point, but a part of the war with no winner, no loser. Only a man trying to hold on to what was important, while still not fully understanding how not to lose them. And when the relationships in his personal life still overlap with unnamed distances, Nicolas Cage gradually found another outlet. Not in family, not in human connections, but in art itself, where he could face himself without needing to explain. If before he had only been an actor stepping into roles as a way to live out unreleased emotions, then in this phase he began to go further, not just acting, but getting deeper into the creative process as someone responsible for what he brought to the world. Nicolas Cage was not the type of artist who accepted standing still in a framework. He did not just take scripts and perform them, but always sought to understand more deeply what was happening inside the character, and more importantly, inside himself. With projects like Adaptation, he did not just play a screenwriter. He almost dissolved into the character, portraying a person struggling with insecurity, self-doubt, and the fear of not being good enough. That was no longer acting. That was reflection. And then with Lord of War, he stepped into a completely different world, cold, pragmatic, full of moral contradictions. But somewhere, it still carried a very familiar feeling, the separation between the outer person and what was happening inside. His role choices in this period were not always immediately understood. There were projects seen as strange, characters judged as too much. But Nicolas Cage did not stop to explain. He continued on his own path because he knew that if he turned back, if he tried to become more understandable, he would lose the only thing that made him himself. But that path was not easy. Participating in independent projects, seeking stories outside Hollywood's mainstream, meant accepting risks financial, reputational, and in how audiences perceived him. There were films that did not succeed commercially. There were roles not highly praised from the start. But for Nicolas Cage, the value of art had never been only in the result. It lay in the process, in how deep he could go, in which parts of himself he could touch that he had not dared to face before. And it was in that process that he began to understand himself more, not in a clear way, not with specific answers, but through small pieces, each role apart, each story a door. Nicolas Cage was no longer just running away from the past, from the emotional voids. He began to turn back and look at them, little by little, through art. He did not talk much about it. He did not turn it into a statement, but in the way he chose roles, in the way he performed, there was a very clear, changeless, noisy, but deeper. Less trying to impress, but more truthful. And there, he was no longer just an actor trying to survive in Hollywood. He became a storyteller, a person, using his own life with all its contradictions and wounds to create something meaningful. Nicolas Cage began to accept that art was not a place to hide, but a place to understand. That each role did not need to be loved by everyone, but needed to be honest. And that failing in a project was not as scary as not daring to try. But no matter how far he had gone on that path, there were always barriers, limits from the outside, and also from within. Hollywood was still a system with its own expectations. Audiences still had certain images of him, and he himself, even though he had learned many things, had not completely escaped doubts about himself. There were times he stood in the middle of a project, in the middle of a role he believed in, but still wondered if he was going in the right direction, whether what he was doing was truly understood or was only making him drift further from what had once helped him succeed. But then, like many times before, he did not stop, not because he was certain, but because he had gotten used to moving forward even without answers. And it was in that continuation, in not abandoning the path he had chosen, that Nicolas Cage gradually redefined himself, not as a star, not as a controversial name, but as an artist, a person who was not perfect, not easy to understand, but real. And in a world where everything was often made easy to consume, easy to accept, perhaps that was exactly what made him rare, a man still trying to say something true, even when no one promised to listen. But the deeper he went into the artistic path he had chosen, Nicolas Cage increasingly realized that there was one thing he could not control, could not avoid, and could not please. That was the way the world perceived him. Fame, which had once opened doors for him to step into Hollywood, now became a distorted mirror, reflecting every action, every decision, and sometimes even the parts he had never wanted anyone to see. The media began to follow him not only for the roles, but for the person himself, personal choices, relationships, imperfect appearances, and in a world where everything could be cut, interpreted, turned into sensational headlines, Nicolas Cage gradually realized that his story no longer belonged to him anymore. There were rumors that appeared which he could not verify, criticisms from people who had never met him but talked about him as if they understood everything. There were moments when a facial expression on screen, a clip taken out of context, became the reason for the whole world to mock. And the most painful thing was not the mockery itself, but the feeling of being misunderstood, that what he tried to express, what he brought into each role, was seen as meaningless exaggeration. Hollywood, which had once been a dream, was now no longer an easy place to belong. Nicolas Cage was not completely cast aside, but he was also no longer at the center like before. He existed in a middle ground where people knew him but were not sure where to place him. There were big projects he was no longer invited to. There were roles that in the past he could easily get, now belonging to newer, safer faces. And while others gradually adapted to the system, Nicolas Cage kept a distance for himself, not completely rejecting it, but not fully integrating either. That made him isolated in a very unique way. Not that there were no people around, but that there were not many people who truly understood the path he was on. But it was in that isolation that something else began to form, a steadfastness that did not need recognition. Nicolas Cage did not change his style to please the audience. He did not try to become more understandable to be accepted. Instead, He held on to what he believed was right, even when it made him stand alone. There were times that caused him to be underestimated. There were times he became the subject of unfair stories, but he did not respond with defensiveness. He did not step out to explain, to argue, to prove. He continued to work, continued to act, continued to choose roles that felt meaningful to him, even knowing that not everyone would understand. And in that silence, there was a very different strength, a strength that did not come from being recognized, but from no longer depending on that recognition. The lessons Nicolas Cage learned in this period did not come from success, but from the way he faced judgment. He learned that not every gaze needed to be answered, that not every criticism needed to be fixed, and that sometimes the best way to hold on to himself was not to let the world define him. But that did not mean he felt nothing. There were days when those words still touched him, still made him wonder if he was going too far, if he was losing something he did not realize. There were moments when he stood in front of the mirror, not to see a character, but to find himself again a person, not cut and pasted, not defined by headlines, not reduced to a single expression. And it was in those moments that he had to answer for himself a question no one else could answer for him. Who was he? When there were no more lights, no more laughter, no more praise or criticism. And each time like that, even though the answer was never completely clear, Nicolas Cage still chose to continue, not because he was sure he was right, but because he believed that continuing to be honest with himself was more important than being accepted. And perhaps that was what made him different, not because he was unaffected by judgment, but because he did not let it change who he was. In a world where images could be built, edited, controlled, Nicolas Cage chose a harder path, with no guarantees, no consensus, but with one thing he had never given up: the truth. And it was in that journey, amid the constantly changing gazes of the public, that he gradually learned how to stand firm, not because nothing could shake him, but because he had gotten used to keeping balance in the very instability of his own life. And then, when the noise of the outside world gradually quieted down, when the praise and criticism no longer echoed as loudly as before, Nicolas Cage began to face something he could not could not avoid, and could not control: his own body. If before he could step into a role with all his intensity, ready to push himself to the limit, now every movement, every workday, carried a quiet reminder that time was no longer on his side. The years of action films, the scenes demanding physical strength, the falls, the impacts that he could once ignore, now began to leave traces. Not always obvious, not always immediately painful, but accumulating, little by little, in the mornings when he woke up with a heavier body, in the nights when sleep no longer came as easily as before. Insomnia was not new to Nicolas Cage, but before, it was the result of thoughts that never stopped, of a mind always active, always searching. Now, it carried a different feeling, a prolonged fatigue, a state where the body no longer kept up with the will as before. There were nights he lay there, looking up at the ceiling, not thinking about roles, not thinking about scripts, but thinking about himself, about what had passed, about what remained, and about what was gradually slipping out of control. Stress no longer came only from work. It came from awareness. Awareness that the body had limits, that what had once been instinct now needed to be considered, that there were things he once did that he could no longer repeat. And in a world where he had gotten used to breaking every limit, having to accept his own limits became a challenge that was not easy to name. Injuries, big or small, were no longer details to be overlooked. They became reminders that every time he stepped into a role, he brought not only experience, but also age. And age was not just a number. It was a feeling. It was the way the body reacted. It was the way the mind began to question before acting. There were days Nicolas Cage stood on set, looking at scenes he could once perform without hesitation, and realized that now he had to think. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood that some risks were no longer worth taking, understood that long-term survival was more important than proving himself one more time. But that change did not come easily. It came with a very real sense of loss. Because when the body began to slow down, a part of him, the part that had grown used to explosion, to pushing everything to the extreme, also had to learn to step back, and he was not always ready for that. There were moments he tried to keep the old pace, tried to act as if nothing had changed, only to realize that he was no longer the man from 10 or 20 years ago. And it was in those moments that a truth began to become clearer than ever, that old age did not arrive like a shock, but like a quiet process, step by step, irreversible. But what made this period heavier was not only physical, it was psychological. When the body changed, the way he saw himself also changed. Nicolas Cage was no longer just an actor looking for the next role. He began to become a person looking back at his entire journey, not with simple pride, but with honesty that was sometimes hard to accept. There were decisions he understood more clearly now. There were mistakes he could no longer deny. And there were things he knew he would never have the chance to do again. But instead of running away from those thoughts, he began to sit with them, not to torment himself, but to understand, to accept that life was not a series of perfect choices, but a journey of things that remained unfinished. And in that acceptance, another change began to take place. Nicolas Cage no longer saw his career as a race. He no longer tried to prove he could still do it all. Instead, he began to choose selectively. Not because he could not do more, but because he no longer needed to. Roles began to feel more personal. Projects were no longer just opportunities, but choices. And in those choices, he found something he had not truly had before: calmness. But that calmness was not the end of a journey. It was a new state where he began to prepare for what came next. Not bigger roles, not more fame, but a different way of living. A way of living, not dependent on Hollywood's pace, not dictated by outside expectations, but shaped by what he truly needed. Family, health, time, things that had once been placed after work, now began to become the center. And in that change, there was a feeling of both relief and regret. Relief because he no longer had to run. Regret because he knew he had run for too long. But perhaps the most important thing was not how far he had gone, but that he was still here, still able to look back, still able to change, still able to live in a different way. Nicolas Cage did not talk much about old age. He did not turn it into a big story, but in the way he moved, in the way he chose, in the silences between projects, one thing could be felt very clearly. He was learning to slow down. Not because he wanted to, but because he understood it was necessary. And in a world that always pushed people to be faster, stronger, more accepting, to slow down was perhaps one of the hardest things, but also the most real. And it was in that truth that Nicolas Cage began to step into a new phase. Not the war to become someone, but the journey to understand who he was when there was nothing left to prove anymore. And when the pace of life slowed down long enough for him to hear himself more clearly, Nicolas Cage began to step into a different phase, not loud, not rushed, but deeper than any time before in his career. No longer choices driven by financial pressure or the fear of being forgotten. He began to choose roles according to a simpler but also more difficult criterion, whether that role said something true to him or not. Scripts were no longer judged by scale or payment, but by the emotions they stirred, and it was in that change that more personal projects began to appear. Not the biggest films, but roles that made him stop, made him think, made him face the parts he had once avoided. Nicolas Cage immersed himself more in independent films, where there were not many guarantees of commercial success, But there was one thing he had been searching for throughout the entire journey: freedom. In those projects, he did not need to fit the image the audience expected. He did not need to prove he was still a star. He only needed to be honest. And that honesty was not always comfortable. There were roles that forced him to return to memories he had once tried to forget. There were characters that reflected the weak parts, the mistakes, the unfinished things in himself. But instead of avoiding them, he stepped into them, not as a challenge, but as a way to understand himself more clearly. Nicolas Cage's professional spirit in this phase was no longer explosive like before. It became quieter, but no less powerful. He no longer acted to impress. He acted to connect with the character, with the story, and sometimes with the audience itself. People who might not fully understand him, but could feel something real in the way he performed. Each role became a dialogue, not between him and the viewers, but between him and himself. And in those dialogues, he began to find answers he had not had time to listen to before. There was a very clear change in the way he approached work. Before, he could take on many projects in a row, moving from one film to another as a way to keep the pace. But now, each project was carefully considered, not because he could not do more, but because he no longer wanted to. Time took on a different value, not quantity, but the quality of what he chose to spend it on. And in those choices, there was a clear presence of age, not as a limitation, but as an awareness. Nicolas Cage understood that he was no longer in the phase where everything could start over from the beginning. But he also understood that did not mean everything had to end. It only meant he needed to do them in a different way, a way that suited the person he was now, a way that did not need to chase anyone, did not need to prove anything to anyone. The roles he chose in this phase were not always widely noticed. There were films known only in small circles. But that did not diminish their value to him, because for the first time in a long time, Nicolas Cage no longer measured success by outside reactions. He measured it by the feeling inside that he had done something meaningful, even if only for a few people. And perhaps it was in that change that he found a form of freedom he had not had before. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from the need to be recognized. But that did not mean everything became easy. Continuing to challenge himself, especially in the context of age and health no longer being what they once were, required a different kind of courage. No longer the recklessness of youth, but the steadfastness of a person who clearly understood what he was trading. There were days when his body no longer responded as before. There were moments when he had to stop, had to listen to his own limits. But he did not stop completely. He only adjusted, found other ways to continue, found other ways to tell the story. And in that adjustment, one thing was very clear, that Nicolas Cage had not given up on art. He was only changing the way he existed in it. No longer the person chasing roles, but the person choosing them. No longer the person swept into the flow of the industry, but the person standing beside it, observing and stepping in when he truly wanted. And it was in that choice that he gradually reshaped his legacy, not by what he had achieved in the past, but by the way he continued to live with art in the present. Not perfect, not loud, but true. And in a world where everything was often judged too quickly, too hastily, perhaps that truth, however small, was still something worth holding on to. And then, when the roles no longer came in a rush, when each choice became slower and more intentional, Nicolas Cage began to do something he had rarely had time for before looking back. Not a quick glance, not a hasty summary, but a slow, deep process, sometimes painful, as he went through each phase of his life one by one, leaving nothing out, not trying to beautify anything. He looked back at the early days, when he was still a young man trying to escape the shadow of his family, carrying a longing to be seen, to be recognized, and an insecurity he had never named. He looked back at the years struggling with the profession, the rejected auditions, the sleepless nights, the moments when he almost believed he was not good enough. And then he looked back at the peak years, when everything seemed to come too fast, too much, to the point he did not have time to understand their value before they began to slip from his hands. But what made this looking back heavy was not what he had lost, but what he had never truly held. There were relationships he had not had enough patience to protect. There were moments he had not been present enough to cherish. There were opportunities to say what needed to be said, to stay when he needed to stay, that he had missed not because he did not care, but because he was always in a state of moving, always chasing something ahead that he believed was more important. And now, when the pace had slowed, those things came back. Not loudly, not with blame, just simply present like voids he could not fill, but also could no longer continue to ignore. Nicolas Cage did not avoid his own mistakes. He did not try to rewrite the past in a more acceptable way. Instead, he looked straight at them as an inseparable part of who he was. He understood that the wrong financial decisions, the broken relationships, the controversial career choices, all were the result of a journey he had lived truthfully, even if imperfectly. And in that acceptance, something began to change. He no longer saw life as a series of things that needed to be fixed. He began to see it as a story that needed to be understood. And in that story, there were people he could not help but mention. Family, not an ideal concept, but a reality full of contradictions, where love and distance coexisted. The people who had stayed, even if they did not always understand him, but still chose not to leave. The people who had left, leaving voids he learned to live with. Friends, those who had seen him at different times, from the early struggling days to the periods when he seemed lost. Directors, mentors, those who had believed in him when he was not sure about himself. And the audience, those who had loved him, doubted him, left him, and sometimes came back, bringing different perspectives, but all contributing to the journey he could not walk alone. Nicolas Cage began to understand that the value of life did not lie in the number of things he had achieved, but in the way he had lived with them. Love not perfect moments, but the ability to stay, even without fully understanding each other. Art not recognition, but honesty. Kindness not grand gestures, but small choices repeated every day, even when no one was watching. And in those values, he found a different kind of peace. Not the end of all contradictions, but the ability to live with them without being swept away. But looking back did not only bring understanding, it also brought regret. There were things Nicolas Cage knew he would never have the chance to do again. Words left unsaid. Moments that had passed, paths that, if taken differently, might have led to a different life. And he did not deny that. He did not try to turn regret into motivation. He left it there as part of the truth, because he understood that without those things, he would not be the person he was becoming. And perhaps it was in that honesty that he learned the most important lesson, that life was not about avoiding mistakes, but about learning to live with them without losing himself. Nicolas Cage did not make grand statements. He did not try to redefine himself with words, but in the way he lived, in the way he chose roles, in the way he faced the past, one thing could be seen clearly. He was learning to be grateful, not only for the good things, but also for the difficult ones. Not only for the people who stayed, but also for those who left. Not only for the successes, but also for the failures that had shaped him. And in that gratitude, there was a very real lightness. Not because everything had been resolved, but because he no longer needed to resolve everything. He only needed to understand, and to continue, in his own way. And when the reflections gradually settled down, when the past was no longer something to run away from but became a part that could be looked at directly, something else began to appear more clearly: the legacy. Not numbers, not awards, but what Nicolas Cage had left behind in the way he existed in art, in the way he moved through an industry that never waited for anyone. His influence did not lie in always being liked, but in never becoming predictable. In a Hollywood where many learned to become standard to last long, Nicolas Cage followed a different path, with no guarantees, no stability, but carrying a mark that no one could copy. Younger actors, whether openly or not, had all seen in him a rare ability, the ability not to be limited by expectations. Not everyone chose to follow that path, but they knew it existed, and that alone was enough to change the way people thought about acting. Nicolas Cage's roles were not always perfect, but many of them became reference points not because they followed the rules, but because they broke them. From a broken man in Leaving Las Vegas, where he did not just act, but seemed to live the self-destruction, to the extreme characters in Face Off, where the line between reason and madness was erased, he created images that audiences did not easily forget, not because they were pleasant, but because they were true in a way that was hard to accept. And that very truth, even if not always immediately embraced, had the ability to last longer than any trend. Nicolas Cage did not build his legacy with stability. He built it with persistence, a persistence sometimes misunderstood as chaos. He continued working when fame was high, and he also continued when fame began to waver. He did not stop when criticized, and he also did not completely change to avoid criticism. That made him a hard-to-categorize phenomenon. Not fully mainstream, but not pushed out either. And in that very not belonging, he created his own space, a place where art did not need to fit in, only needed to be honest. Pop culture had its own ways of reacting to him. There were periods when he was celebrated as one of the bravest actors of his generation. There were other periods when he became an image cut and pasted, turned into quick entertainment symbols, sometimes not reflecting the real person he was. But even in those images, one thing did not change. He could not be ignored. Whether loved or mocked, Nicolas Cage was always present, and in a world where attention was often short-lived, maintaining that presence through decades, through many changes, was itself a form of legacy. But perhaps his greatest influence was not in what people saw on screen, but in what they felt when looking at his journey. For those who had ever felt they did not belong to any mold, Nicolas Cage was proof that it was still possible to exist in one's own way. For those who had failed, been misunderstood, been underestimated, his story was not a promise that everything would become easier, but a reminder that continuing, even imperfectly, still had value. He did not inspire by becoming an ideal model. He inspired by not hiding his imperfect parts. And it was in that imperfection that others could see something familiar, a struggle they were also going through, a feeling they did not know how to name. Nicolas Cage did not stand on a high pedestal to be admired from afar. He existed in a closer place, a place where the complexity of being human was accepted, not to be solved, but to be understood. And throughout that journey, no matter how many times he was questioned, doubted, or removed from the center of attention, he still continued to contribute to art in his own way, not always immediately recognized, not always correctly understood, but over time, what he left behind began to be seen from a different angle, not as scattered choices, but as a consistent journey of a person who had never given up searching for truth in what he did. And perhaps that was what made Nicolas Cage's legacy special. Not because it was perfect, but because it was alive. It changed. It reflected a man who did not stand still, did not stay framed, did not stop experimenting, even when it came at a cost. In an industry where safety was often put first, daring to be unsafe, daring to be uncertain, daring to be unlike anyone was perhaps his greatest contribution. And in some way, even if not everyone realized it immediately, what he had done, had lived, had held on to, would continue to exist. Not only in the films, but in the way people perceived art, and also in the way a person could continue to be themselves, even when the world kept demanding they become someone else, and when the concepts of legacy were no longer just what others said about him, but became something Nicolas Cage himself had to face every day. His life stepped into another phase, no longer loud, no longer pulled by the constant demands of the industry, but quieter, deeper, and more real. Old age did not come to him like a shock, but like a prolonged realization, little by little, through quieter mornings, through longer gaps between projects, through times when he no longer needed to rush to prove anything. Professional pressure, which had once taken up almost his entire life, began to lessen, not because he no longer had the ability, but because he no longer let it define him. And in that space, Nicolas Cage began to look back at his journey, not with judgment, but with an almost raw honesty. He saw a man who had gone very far, had experienced so much, but had also missed quite a lot. The years when he had run non-stop, had believed that as long as he kept moving forward, everything would be fine, now appeared under a different light. Not wrong, but not entirely right either. There were moments he wished he had stopped earlier, had listened more, had stayed longer with the important people, but instead of sinking into regret, he began to learn how to keep those emotions in a different place, not to forget, but to understand. Nicolas Cage no longer tried to deny the loneliness that had accompanied him for many years. He no longer saw it as something that needed to be removed. Instead, he looked at it as part of the journey, a part that had helped him create the roles, the choices, the moments that, without it, he might not have become the person he was now. The losses, the incomplete relationships, the separations without clear explanations, all were there, not disappearing, but no longer carrying the same weight, because he began to see them not as failures, but as traces of a life that had been lived truthfully. And in that change, something else gradually became clearer: family. Not an ideal concept, but specific people, with imperfect relationships that still existed. His children, his relatives, the small moments that in the past he might have overlooked, now became more important than ever. Nicolas Cage did not try to become a perfect father. He only tried to be present, truly present, not distracted, not pulled by what was waiting ahead. And in those moments, he found a different kind of peace. Not the absence of problems, but the ability to stay with what was there. Love, in this phase, was no longer something to be searched for. It was something he began to realize had always been there, even if imperfect, even if not always easy to understand. He no longer tried to define it. He no longer tried to make it fit any mold. He simply accepted that love could simply be two people choosing to stay, even if they did not always understand each other, even if they did not always agree. And in that acceptance, there was a very real lightness. But along with that lightness came a clearer awareness of time. Nicolas Cage understood that what lay ahead was no longer as long as what lay behind. Not as a fear, but as a truth. And that very truth made him begin to prepare not for an ending, but for a continuation. He began to think more about what he could leave behind, not in the form of assets or fame, but in the form of experience. What he had learned, had gone through, had understood, not to teach, but to share, not to direct others, but to show them that there was no single path to follow. Nicolas Cage did not become a completely different person in these years. He remained himself, still complex, still unpredictable, still carrying contradictions he had not fully resolved. But there was a clear change. He no longer fought against himself as before. He no longer tried to fix everything. He began to accept that there were parts of himself that would always be that way, and instead of seeing them as weaknesses, he learned to live with them. Not easily, but truly. There were afternoons when there was no shooting schedule, no script to read. Nicolas Cage simply sat still doing nothing, not thinking too much, just being present. And in those moments, He was no longer the actor, no longer a name, no longer an image. He was just a person who had been through many things, had kept some things, had lost some things, but was still here. And perhaps it was in that simplicity that he found something he had always searched for in more complicated places: completeness. Not enough by anyone else's standards, but enough for himself. Nicolas Cage did not say he had understood his entire life. He did not claim that everything had been resolved. But he knew one thing, that he did not need to understand everything to continue. He only needed to accept and to keep going in his own way. And in that acceptance, there was a kind of awakening that did not come from one big moment, but from hundreds, thousands of small moments. The times he chose to stay, chose to listen, chose not to run away. And, perhaps, after everything that had passed, that was what truly mattered most. And then, at the age of 62, when his steps were no longer hurried like before, when the roles no longer came like rushing waves but became conscious choices, Nicolas Cage stopped not to end, but to look at the entire journey that had brought him here. A life that did not follow a straight line, did not obey any mold, but bent, broke, and then continued in ways no one could predict. He saw a boy who had grown up in instability, carrying questions with no answers. He saw a young man who had chosen to leave the Coppola name to build himself from scratch, not because of confidence, but because there was no other choice. He saw an actor who had reached the peak, holding the golden Oscar statue in his hand, and then the same man stepping into the years when fame was no longer a shield. He saw the wrong decisions, the lost assets, the fractured relationships, the opportunities that had passed and could not be taken back. But he also saw other things: the times he stood up when no one was watching, the days he continued working when nothing was guaranteed, the moments he chose not to give up, even when everything around him seemed to be collapsing. And it was in that confrontation that one thing began to become clearer than ever: legacy was not what others said about you, but what you had managed to keep when everything else left. Nicolas Cage did not leave behind a perfect image. He was not a symbol of stability, not a story of a path that was always right. But perhaps that was exactly why his legacy felt more real. He left behind something that could not be framed: a proof that a person could be wrong, could lose direction, could be misunderstood, but could still continue, could still live with their own honesty, without needing to turn into a more acceptable version. Patience, not waiting for everything to get better, but continuing when things were not good. Resilience, not never falling, but not staying down there too long. Kindness, not grand gestures, but the way he treated those around him even when he himself was struggling. Creativity, not to impress, but to say something true even if not everyone was ready to listen. And above all, self-respect, a thing it had taken him many years to understand, and perhaps he would continue learning for the rest of his life. Nicolas Cage was not perfect, and he did not try to become so, but it was that very imperfection, those cracks, those confusing choices, those steps that deviated from expectations, that created an image not easily forgotten. A man who did not try to become a symbol, but became something deeper: a mirror. Not a mirror reflecting perfection, but a mirror reflecting truth. And in that truth, others could see themselves, the parts they had once hidden, the failures they had once been ashamed of, the questions they had never dared to ask. Nicolas Cage did not provide answers for all of that. He only showed that it was still possible to continue even when there were no answers. And when looking forward, what he left behind was not a completed story, but a journey that was still open. Young actors, artists searching for their own path might not follow the way he had gone, but they would know that such a path existed, a path that did not need to be accepted by everyone, but could still lead to a meaningful life. People who had once felt lost, who had once felt they did not fit what was expected, could look at his story and realized they were not the only ones. That difference was not something that needed to be fixed, but something that could be understood. And in that way, Nicolas Cage continued to influence, not through new roles, but through what he had lived. But perhaps the most important thing was not the influence, but the gratitude. Gratitude for what had passed, even if imperfect. Gratitude for the people who had stayed, even if they did not always understand. Gratitude, even for the things that had been lost, because they had shaped him in a way nothing else could. And in that gratitude, there was a gentle but unmistakable reminder that the value of a life did not lie in the number of times you won, but in the way you walked through the times you did not win. Not in avoiding pain, but in the way you lived with it without losing yourself. Not in who you became in the eyes of others, but in being able to be yourself even when it was not easy. Nicolas Cage did not close his story with a clear ending. He did not need to. Because life, like the roles he had chosen, did not always need a perfect conclusion. Sometimes the only thing necessary was to continue. And he was still continuing. In his own way, the story of Nicolas Cage, when looking back at the entire journey we have just gone through, is not a story that makes people feel comfortable, but a story that makes people stop, think, and sometimes feel pain. Pain not because he failed, but because he had to carry so much in silence from an unstable childhood, with a mother suffering from mental illness and a broken family, to the years trying to escape the Coppola shadow to define himself, then reaching the peak with Leaving Las Vegas, but still not finding inner peace. What hurts the most is not that he lost millions of dollars, had to sell houses and assets that were once symbols of success, but that he still continued to work, continued to take roles he himself knew were not perfect, not out of passion, but out of responsibility and survival. While the public turned him into a joke through memes, few realized that behind those expressions was a man trying to hold on to himself amid the collapse. And then, when age came, when his body began to slow down, when sleepless nights and accumulated injuries became part of life, Nicolas Cage did not choose to stop, but chose to change, chose roles like Pig, chose silence over noise, chose honesty over pleasing others. That was not a big victory, but a deeper form of victory over himself. For the American people, in a society that values success, speed, and perfection, this story is a very real reminder that life does not always go according to plan, and the value of a person does not lie in never stumbling, but in the way they stand up after being misunderstood, after loss, after isolation. Nicolas Cage is not perfect, but that very imperfection makes him closer proof that you can still continue, can still live meaningfully, even when things no longer look like what you once expected. If the story of Nicolas Cage makes you see life and resilience in a different way, please hit subscribe to continue accompanying us on the emotional journeys ahead. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video where untold stories are still waiting to be shared.